Welcome to session 25 on Biblical Worldview 1. As in the last session, we are discussing alternate worldviews, and we are continuing in this particular video to discuss the Islamic worldview. And we want to pick up here with what they consider to be their special revelation. That is, where do Muslims turn for direction? Well, like other worldviews, Islam proposes answers to life's ultimate questions, and it claims sources of knowledge in support of its answers. So, Muslims believe that God sent messengers to every nation to teach submission and warn people against false religious teachings and practices. This is found in the Quran, chapter 16, verse 36, and chapter 35, verse 24. Moses and Jesus are considered prophets of Islam, as well as Ishmael, Isaac, and Jacob. Chapter 3, verse 67, chapter 61, verse 6, and chapter 2, verse 136. Muslims are expected to take us Muslims are expected to honor these prophets and their respective books in chapter 4, verse 136. And as we noted earlier, religions predating Muhammad are understood by Muslims as having been originally Islamic and their prophets Muslims, chapter 15, verse 10. Now, Muhammad is seen as the successor of the prophets of old, chapter 61, verse 6. Many Muslims even believe the Bible contains prophecies about him, most significantly Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 18, and John 14, verse 16. While other prophets were for a certain time and place, Muhammad is considered to be the one prophet of all for all humankind, chapter 7, verse 158, and chapter 34, verse 28, as well as he is also considered the final prophet, chapter 33 and verse 40. Now, a well-known hadith says, Allah's apostle said, "My similitude in comparison with the other prophets before me is that of a man who has built a house nicely and beautifully, except for a place of one brick in a corner. The people go about it and wonder at its beauty, but say, 'Would that this brick be put in its place.' So I am that brick, and I am the last of the prophets." Now, as the seal of the prophets, Muhammad's teachings, embodied in the Quran, are viewed as the incomparable, infallible, and final revelation from God, confirming all previous revelations. This is chapter 17, verses 88 and 89, and chapter 10, verse 37, and chapter 46, verse 12. Muslims believe that the words of the Quran are the literal words of God, which were dictated word for word to the Prophet Muhammad over a period of 23 years through the angel Jibril, which is the Arabic for Gabriel. Muslims believe the previous revelations were textually corrupted, as we said earlier. The Quran is the culmination of God's revelation to humanity and kept incorruptible by God, inscribed on a tablet in heaven. This is chapter 85, verses 21 and 22. In chapter 15, verse 9, it says, "We have, without doubt, sent down the message," that is the Quran, "and we will assuredly guard it from corruption." Now, Khurshid Ahmad claims the following about the Quran. He says, "The Quran is the revealed book of God which has been in existence for the last 1400 years, and the Word of God is available in its original form. Detailed accounts of the life of the Prophet of Islam and his teachings are available in their pristine purity. There has not been an iota of change in this unique historic record. Now, when you think of the Quran, keep in mind that Muslims believe it to be the best and most beautiful book on earth. There is no equal, and nothing surpasses it in content or quality. To disrespect the Quran is a grave insult to Muslims, the most heinous act a person could commit. Now, the other major source for Islamic theology today is the Hadith. The Hadith is composed of traditions of the teachings, rulings, and actions of Muhammad and his early and chief companions. These traditions include the Sunnah, which are descriptions of Muhammad's exemplary actions. Muslims believe these two sources are authoritative, providing lenses through which Muslims apply God's revelation to all of life. Now, what does Islam say about humanity? The biblical message is that we are created in the image of God in Genesis chapter 1, and that despite the fall, we continue to bear that image, James chapter 3 and verse 9. Being made in God's image distinguishes humans from all other creatures, including angels. But the Islamic perspective is radically different. Badru Katarega says this: the Christian witness that man is created in the image and likeness of God is not the same as the Muslim witness. Although God breathed into man his spirit, as both Christians and Muslims believe, for Islam, the only divine qualities entrusted to humans as a result of God's breath were those of knowledge, will, and power of action. If people use these divine qualities rightly in understanding God and following his law strictly, then he has nothing to fear in the present or the future, and no sorrow for the past. So Muslims acknowledge humans as vice regents on earth, but they reject the image of God as being on humans. Muslims see humans as slaves of God, not his sons and daughters, as Christianity does. Okay, what does Islam say is wrong with us? Well, when Allah created the world, Muslims say, Adam and Eve were actually Muslim. Adam was even a prophet of Islam, and although Adam and Eve disobeyed Allah's original prohibition and ate from the forbidden tree, their mistake, which was not sin, was quickly forgiven. And though their action resulted in the world not being as it should, with humans rebelling against God, Allah has sent Islam to offer humanity a way back to its pristine state. Now, Muslims believe every human being is born a Muslim in a state of submission to Allah. But from very young ages, we are led astray to worship false gods or to deny God altogether. It was up to the prophets of Allah to speak to the nations and correct these errors of belief and practice. Now, because the world was created in submission to Allah, and every human being is born a Muslim, to refuse to become a Muslim is rebellion against Allah. It is the obligation of Muslims to battle rebellion against God through jihad. Now, jihad has two facets. First, it is the battle against temptation and sin for the sake of developing virtue and self-control. In other words, it can imply battling one's own rebellion. The second facet is the battle against any and all who oppose Islam. Some call this second aspect of jihad holy war, as we have seen before. As the famous Arab historian Ibn Khaldun said, in the Muslim community, the holy war is a religious duty. Because of the universalism of the Muslim mission and the obligation to convert everybody to Islam, either by persuasion or force. Fighting against non-Muslims is viewed not as an act of aggression, but an act of restoration, the offering of Allah's mercy to those willing to end their rebellious ways. Now, to the more radical Muslims, the Islamists, peace occurs when non-Muslims cease rebelling. The vision of Islamists, then, is that one day Islam will establish peace by quashing such rebellion at a global level. If Islamists seem dismissive when accused of aggression, it is because they view jihad as merely a response to aggressive unbelief. They think, you are the ones in rebellion against Allah. We are helping you be restored to Him as He commands and as is best for you. Now, Western Muslims take pains to assure Westerners that Islam is a religion of peace. But we must be careful to recognize that Islamists do not hold this view, nor do the extreme Islamists we have called jihadis, who are eager to use physical violence to complete Muhammad's mission. Now, to the Islamist mind, any nation that refuses to permit Muslims to live as they please and to adopt and propagate Islam must be forced into submission for its own good and for the glory of God. Islam is Dar-ul Islam, house of peace. And those nations that refuse Islam are considered Dar-ul Harb, which is house of war. Because there is no official leader to issue a call to jihad, jihadis often take it upon themselves to fight the West when and how they can. To these Islamists, the refusal to allow Sharia law is a great offense and one that must be fought against. In areas dominated by Islam, there is a provision called dhimitude, in which Christians and Jews, that is, people of the book, is what they're called in Islam, may live in peace without converting to Islam. As Dehimus, though, Christians and Jews are officially second-class citizens and are often harassed, persecuted, oppressed, and sometimes killed. Now, I want to go back for a moment to the idea of Sharia law and the fact that the Muslims, both moderate and Islamist or jihadis, they want Sharia law to be the law of the land. And what I have seen is that in other countries, such as Tanzania, when I was living there, what I've seen is the government of any particular country, like Tanzania, for instance, when their Muslim population reaches a certain point, that is to say, in Tanzania, on the coast of Tanzania, which is on the, I believe it's the Indian Ocean, the coast of Tanzania, it's East Africa, the Muslim population is about 50%. That is to say, 50% of the population are Muslim. Now, as you get away from the coast and work your way inland to the west, to the just about 2 or 3 hours, maybe an hour or two in from the coast, the Muslim population drops to about 30%. Okay, so of the whole population of Tanzania, I would guess that it is somewhere around probably 35 or 40% of the people of Tanzania are Muslim. Now that might be lower, I'm not sure, but I guess it's something we could look up. Hold on just a second. I have to take a call. Okay, sorry about that. As I was saying, I don't know the exact percentage of the whole of Tanzania, but what I'm trying to get at here is that the law of Muslims, Sharia law, is recognized by the courts in Tanzania, and therefore the if a Muslim is brought before the court, then Sharia law is used to try his case. And while I don't know of any exact examples, I'm sure that there are Muslim judges, okay, that is, judges who are Muslim in the Tanzanian court system, who can be, criminals and cases and so forth can be brought before those judges, and they would use Sharia law to judge those cases. So my point is that when the population of a country reaches a certain threshold, that Muslims have the power, the influence to speak out and want and can get Sharia law imposed on at least them, that is, they want to use Sharia law to judge their cases, then a country will will implement that for them. Well, as they grow even more, as the population grows even more, then they become more vocal. They become more violent in certain cases, and I have received many emails. When I was in Tanzania, I was on an email list from the United States Embassy, which was in Dar es Salaam. Okay, and what they would do is they would say, okay, there's going to be a demonstration, and the understanding was that in most of these cases that this is a Muslim demonstration. Okay, there's going to be a demonstration at such and such a place, at such and such a time. Okay, and they will give a warning. It says violence is not expected, but you never know, it can break out. Okay, so I've received untold number of emails about those kinds of things, and I have been in Dar es Salaam when those types of emails are sent out, and I have done my best to stay away from those areas during that time. But the fact is that these things have gotten out of control, whether it's be in Tanzania or in other places around the world, and it has resulted in some pretty bad things happening. So, again, my point is that as the Muslim population grows in a country or in an area, they will push for Sharia law to be used. And if they get to be the overwhelming majority of a country, okay, then they will make Sharia law be the standard law for everybody. And everyone else outside of Islam has to submit to Sharia law. Okay? Now that's the general pattern for how these things happen. Okay? Again, I am sure that there are peaceful Muslims. I've met them. Okay? But I'm just saying that there is that part in my thinking that wonders whether even a peaceful Muslim at this point in their life is simply just telling me what they want me to hear, so that when it gets to a point where they are in the majority, they can then switch the tables, so to speak, turn the tables, and reveal their true colors, so to speak, their true intents and thoughts and feelings. So just if you doubt what I've said, and that's fine, just Google the idea of Sharia law and limit it just to the United States. Okay, that is to say, Sharia law in the United States, and I think you will find that there are certain Muslim communities even in the United States who have made statements, who have pushed for, maybe not very much, but they have pushed for Sharia law to be implemented, at least in their community. Okay? And I know this is the case in Europe, where Muslim communities, like in France, for example, there are Muslim communities in Paris, or maybe there's one big Muslim community in Paris, where the French police, as far as I understand it, do not go. They simply do not go in that area. And the Muslims are expected to keep their own peace, so to speak. So it's something that needs to be considered. Okay. But getting back to these, again, in areas dominated by Islam, there is this provision called the himitude, in which Christians and Jews may live in peace without converting to Islam, but they are considered second-class citizens, and they are expected to pay what is called the jizya, J-I-Z-Y-A-H, which is the tax on unbelievers. And it is a burden so heavy that sometimes non-Muslims can do little more than live as slaves. Okay, now these again are situations where the population is dominated by Muslims. I know of certain cases of this, in certain countries. I believe I've heard of it in Egypt and Iran and Iraq, and I don't know if Saudi Arabia is doing it or not, but the unbelievers, the non-believers, the non-Muslims are taxed. Okay? Now, what does Islam say about how we should live? Well, according to Islam, more important than what you believe is what you do. Adherents to Islam have only 5 basic requirements, possibly 6, to which they must conform. As they do so, their individual actions are subsumed into the community, creating a collective mindset and generating a way of life unique from all other religions in the world. Now, the first pillar of Islam is Shahada, the confession of faith. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. If a person pronounces this confession with sincerity of mind and heart, then he or she is a Muslim. Under this pillar, all other obligations are subsumed, for to believe in God and Muhammad as his prophet is to obey the Quran and follow the example of Muhammad's life. The second pillar is Salat, or prayer. Muslims are expected to engage in prayer 5 times a day facing Mecca. On Friday, Muslim men, and in some cases women, are expected to meet at a mosque to engage in prayer at noon. Prayer provides a daily rhythm to Muslim life. Muslims hope to please God by remembering Him constantly with regulated prayer. Muslims also hope that systematic praying will help them avoid temptations to immorality. The mosque is central to Islamic life. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, describes their purposes in martial terms. That is, the mosques are our barracks, the domes our helmets, the minarets our bayonets, and the faithful our soldiers. The third pillar is Sawam, which is fasting during Ramadan. This involves refraining from food, smoking, and sexual relations during the daylight hours, though these may be enjoyed after sundown. These periods of fasting are to encourage and enable Muslims to develop self-control, to discourage bad habits, and to refocus their minds toward personal spiritual progress. But let me just throw this in about the fasting during Ramadan. Okay? It is, well, let me put it this way. I have heard from very good sources, okay, that what happens in some cases during Ramadan is that, yes, they will fast during the day, okay, from sunup to sundown, probably taking only water, and in some cases, not even that. Okay, complete and total fasting from drinking and eating of any kind. Now, once the sun goes down, they basically have a feast. They eat constantly during the night hours, or for several hours after sundown. They get to the point where they even some get to the point where they even gorge themselves, and just, you know, to the point almost of you know, way too much to eat. Okay, so Ramadan is something that is, I guess, to each his own kind of thing. After sundown and before sunup of the next day, the idea of fasting, but not really. Okay, you know, a total fast, or just a water fast, is something that, in my understanding, at least under Christianity, is something that goes on for, you know, whatever set period of time you have, whether it be 12 hours or whether it be 24 hours or 48 or longer. Okay, Jesus and Moses and Elijah, all three fasted, and as far as we understand it, it was a complete fast. Not even water was taken for 40 days. Okay? So, you know, in those cases, they did not wait until the sun went down to eat. They were completely fasting. So because of what I know about Ramadan personally, again, you know, from not seeing it with my own eyes, but knowing this from very good sources in Tanzania, again, having lived there for 10 years, this is something that that is, at least in my mind, uh, kind of I don't know, a bit hypocritical to me. Okay. Well, the fourth pillar of Islam is zakat, which is giving of alms or giving in charitable ways. Muslims are expected to give 2.5% of their annual capital to the poor, either directly through Muslim charitable organizations, either directly to the poor or through Muslim charitable donation organizations. Giving to the poor is intended to achieve a generous lifestyle and a sense of caring for the Muslim community, especially those lacking physical and financial means. Now, I have seen this personally. Muslim businesses in Tanzania will have a kind of a bowl of money. Coins is usually what was used in Tanzania. But, I'm sure sometimes, bills were used, but I've only seen the coins. And what they would do is they would have a bowl of these coins by their register or near on their counter somewhere where they could reach it, and a poor person, a disabled person, a street person, homeless, would come in, and they would give them one of those coins. And what they could do, if they were able to walk or move in any way, they would go to each of these Muslim businesses every day and get one of those coins. Okay. Right now, on the exchange rate, there is, let's see, if they gave out a 500 shilling coin, right now that would be about 25 American cents. Okay. But a little bit less than that, actually, probably 20 American cents. But again, this is where these people are doing so directly, to the poor themselves, and I'm sure they give also to those charitable organizations. Now, the fifth pillar of Islam is a pilgrimage called Hajj. You've probably heard of this term, but all Muslims are expected to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime if their finances and their health permit. Now, during their pilgrimage, Muslims don white garments and remove all indicators of status or class. This practice is intended to help Muslims recognize that before God they are all equal. Racial, gender, and economic differences are muted as masses of Muslims from many nations bow together to worship Allah. Now, those Muslims we are referring to as Islamists would add jihad, again, the principle of compelling non-Muslims to cease their rebellion against God, as the sixth pillar of Islam. Jihad is seen as the most self-sacrificing action Islamists can undertake. Indeed, Islamists who die in jihad are guaranteed entrance into paradise, where men have access to 72 virgins. Women, however, are not told what awaits them on the other side. Now, these pillars encompass the basic moral obligations for Muslims. Obey them, and you are considered to be faithfully submitted to Allah. But there is also the matter of law. The Quran specifies prohibitions on certain foods: pork, animals that have died of themselves; wine, animals slaughtered in pagan ceremonies; and a number of legal rules concerning family law, concerning marriage, divorce, and inheritance; criminal law, which is it includes what is called the hudud crimes, including penalties of highway robbery, illicit sexual activity, slander, and wine drinking, rules about witnesses, and commercial regulation, including the ban on riba, which is interest, and forms of contracts. This law, again, is called Sharia. Well, because the Quran does not address all questions of law, Muslim legal scholars also turn to a second source, the Sunnah, to discern the shape of Sharia. This body of material contains many more legal rulings and examples than the Quran. A fundamental difficulty is that many of the hadith present conflicting or contradictory rulings arising from different places and times. Because much of the historical context is unrecorded, examples and rulings are often left open to debate. In addition to the Quran and the Sunnah, a third source for Sharia is the communal consensus, which is called Ijma, I-J-M-A. This is expressed among Muslim jurists or judges of the first 3 centuries of Islam. An example of Sharia arising from this source is male circumcision, a practice not commanded in the Quran. In some areas, the practice of female circumcision, really it's female genital mutilation, often including a removal of the clitoris, either partially or in its entirety. And this is seen as demanded by Sharia as well. This illustrates how local customs sometimes rise to the level of Sharia in Muslim communities. Now, the fourth source of Sharia arises from legal reasoning needed to address situations otherwise unaddressed in the Quran and the Hadith. But not all Muslims support this approach to legal rulings, which has given rise to various legal traditions. One of the more pronounced differences regards the consumption of alcohol. Now, Ruthven notes, while some judges would argue that only fermented products of the date palm and the vine are prohibited, others, basing their judgments on what is called the qiyas, would insist that all alcoholic drinks are forbidden, since the effective cause or common denominator behind the prohibition was the same in each case. Now, the greatest headache for Muslim legal scholars concerning life in the modern world is the principle of abrogation, which states that later passages in the Quran overrule or thus abrogate earlier passages. It is a significant question because the peaceful, merciful nature of Allah presented in the first part of the Quran disappears in the second part. It is replaced by a version of Allah with a noticeable sense of revenge and bloodlust. If later passages supersede earlier ones, we can expect adherents to become more aggressive and violent the more doctrinally sensitive they become. The greatest source of disagreement among Muslim sects or divisions within Muslim Islam is their respective interpretation of Sharia law. Muslims themselves disagree about its application because the Quran does not speak to all or even many legal issues. In addition, many of its statements are ambiguous and addressed to specific historical situations. Ruthven comments, as for the special injunctions about the Muslims' struggles against and relationship with the non-Muslims, these varied according to situations and were too specific to be termed laws in the strict sense. While this author seems to downplay the grip Sharia law has on Muslims throughout Islamic history, many Muslims have read such commands as normative, especially as they are applied to help non-Muslims cease their rebellion against God. Modern Muslims, especially those educated in the West, see the difficulty, but perhaps out of fear or a desire to not disturb Muslim unity, they often remain silent. To illustrate the threatening nature of Sharia law, consider the case of Yusuf Nadarkhani, an Iranian Christian preacher who first in 2006 and then again in 2009 was arrested for converting to Christianity. He faced possible execution, but was freed only through international pressure sparked by extensive media coverage. His attorney, Muhammad Ali Dadka, jailed in a brutal prison for advocating Nader Khani's case and other human rights cases, was not released from prison. How are we to understand other worldviews based on Islam? Well, in contrast to a biblical Christian view of the nature of humanity, the Muslim community cannot, within its religion, find a sound basis for individual freedom. Adherence is demanded. Those who leave it are in danger of their lives. Those who choose not to belong are in danger of subjugation or death, and basic human rights are violated as a matter of course. On the one hand, there is a tradition of tolerance in Islam. One prominent Pakistani Muslim scholar states this: all non-Muslims will have the freedom of conscience, opinion, expression, and association as the one enjoyed by Muslims themselves, subject to the same limitations as are imposed by law on Muslims. On the other hand, another scholar says that these views are not accepted by most Islamic schools of law, especially in regard to freedom of expression, like criticism of Islam and the government. Even in a country like Pakistan, the homeland of the first scholar, it is illegal to criticize the government or the head of state. Many political prisoners are confined to jails in Pakistan and most other Islamic countries. Through the course of history, except in rare cases, not even Muslims have been given freedom to criticize Islam without being persecuted or sentenced to death. It is far less likely for a non-Muslim living in Muslim-dominated lands to get away with criticizing Islam. Now, we've spoken of the severe tax that is placed on non-Muslims living in predominantly Muslim countries. All taxes on trade and transport paid by Muslims are generally doubled for non-Muslims. In addition, the population, but particularly the non-Muslim population, was subject to ruinous extortions designed to cover the financing of wars that were kept going. Because Muslims have often been at war, non-Muslims who dare to remain in Muslim lands are taken advantage of to finance Muslim aggression. Most troubling is how these non-Muslims are treated when they cannot pay the tax. Churches have been destroyed, people have been dispossessed from their houses, and children have been taken and sold into slavery, not to mention personal atrocities such as dismemberment, torture, and death. There was a time when Muslims embraced those of other monotheistic faiths, such as Jews and Christians, but this came to an end when the finished work of Muhammad, with the finished work of Muhammad and the full revelation of the Quran. Now only Muslims are accepted by God. In chapter 3, verse 85 of the Quran, it says, "If anyone desires a religion other than Islam, never will it be accepted of him, and in the hereafter he will be in the ranks of those who have lost all spiritual good." Now, except in the tradition of what's called Ahmadiyya, and possibly in Baha'i, the Baha'i faith, there is not a Muslim tradition of a state of peace in which Muslims leave everyone else alone. Non-Muslims must be made to submit, and even Jews and Christians are considered to be in rebellion until they do so. One of the grand sheikhs in Cairo said, "All Jews are not the same. The good ones become Muslims. The bad ones do not." Several Muslim legal scholars have explored the possibility of adjusting the Quran to fit more with modern times, but these efforts are viewed with disdain by most Muslim authorities. Because Muhammad was the final prophet and the Quran God's final revelation, according to Muslims, they reject all claims to new divine revelation or inspired prophets. Thus, they are highly critical of groups branching off of Islam, such as the Baha'i, the Ahmadiyya, and the Nation of Islam, which assert prophetic continuation past Muhammad. The conflict between Islam and other worldviews, then, will likely continue as long as Islam continues to grow as a force in the modern world. And given that Muslim families typically have significantly more children per family than non-Muslim families, this is practically guaranteed. This alarming reality concerns many people in the world. One worldview, secularism, sees both Islam and Christianity as dangerous because they aim to take over the world. If they do, any hope of building a society based on science and reason will be dashed. As we will see in our next set of lectures, the notion that all deity-based worldviews must be put in their place is in the motivating force of the secularist worldview. All right, that brings us to the end of our lecture on Islam. We will pick up again with the worldview, as I said, of secularism in the next lecture, and maybe one more after that. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Have a good day.